On a quiet Texas road, a single father sees smoke and rushes into the flames. He saves a stranger's life only to discover she's engaged to the man trying to destroy his family business. But when she begs him not to call her fiancé, he realizes there's more to this crash than twisted metal. As whispers turn into headlines and her powerful fiancé strikes back, the small-town mechanic and the runaway bride are caught in a fight that could save or shatter their entire community. Secrets are buried in contracts, brake lines, and the past they never expected to share. Now, the clock is ticking, and one question remains. Can they stand together against a man who's willing to burn everything to win? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Maple Street as children's laughter filled the air. From Eli's front porch, the scene looked like something from a painting. Kids racing their bikes down the gentle slope, others playing hopscotch on chalk-drawn squares, and a group tossing a frisbee back and forth on the Hendersons' lawn. The old porch swing creaked rhythmically as Eli and Maya sat side by side, watching the peaceful scene unfold. A gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of Mrs. Wilson's rose garden from next door, mixing with the familiar aroma of motor oil and fresh-cut grass that always seemed to follow Eli home from the garage. "Remember when we thought we might lose all this?" Maya asked softly, her eyes following little Tommy Parker as he showed his younger sister how to ride without training wheels. Eli nodded, feeling the weight of those memories even as his heart swelled with gratitude. "Some days it felt like pushing against a mountain," he said, his voice steady and warm. "But look at us now." The swing let out another lengthy squeak as they rocked, making them both chuckle. Maya raised an eyebrow at him. "How long have you been promising to fix this swing?" "About as long as you've been reminding me to fix it," Eli replied with a grin, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Though I suppose I'm running out of excuses now that the garage is doing better than ever." Down the street, the Thompson twins waved as they rode past on their matching blue bicycles. Eli had helped their father install new chains on those bikes just last weekend in the Apprentice Bay. The thought made him smile. That new addition to the garage had become so much more than just a training space. "The apprentice program's really taking off," Maya observed as if reading his thoughts. "I saw Jeremy teaching that new kid, what's his name, Marcus? How to do an oil change yesterday." "Marcus," Eli confirmed, nodding. "Good kid. Reminds me a lot of myself at that age, more interested in taking things apart than sitting in a classroom." He paused, watching a cardinal land on the porch railing. "Though I have to say, he's picking things up faster than I ever did." Maya leaned her head against his shoulder, and Eli felt something in his chest settle, like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. The sound of children playing mingled with the distant hum of the plant, not the intrusive roar it might have been, but a gentle reminder of progress done right. "I was thinking about Mrs. Pearl today," Maya said quietly. "Remember what she told us about that freedom quilt? About love being the only fabric that doesn't fray?" "She always did have a way with words," Eli replied, his voice soft with remembrance. "I think about her every time I walk into that Apprentice Bay that bears her name." A comfortable silence fell between them as they watched Tommy successfully let go of his sister's bicycle, her delighted squeal of achievement echoing down the street. The moment seemed to hold all the promise they'd fought for: community, growth, and the simple joy of neighbors helping neighbors. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, its light catching on the windows of the community center down the street. The building stood proud and well-maintained now, its walls freshly painted, the garden out front bursting with native flowers. Through its windows, Eli could see the lights on in the veterans' meeting room, where he knew George was probably leading another support group session. "You know what I love most about all this?" Maya asked, gesturing to the scene before them. "It's not just that we won against Trent or that we saved the garage. It's that everyone came together. We're stronger now than we ever were before." Eli nodded, thinking of all the small victories that had led to this moment: the CBA that protected their most vulnerable neighbors, the apprenticeship program giving young people a path forward, the way the whole town had stood together when it mattered most. The swing creaked again, and Maya chuckled. "Seriously, though, when are you going to fix this thing?" "Maybe tomorrow," Eli said with a smile, knowing full well he'd probably put it off again. Some things, he'd learned, were perfect just the way they were, squeaks and all. The sound of footsteps on the porch steps made them both look up. Mrs. Wilson approached with a plate of cookies, still warm from the oven. "Thought you two might like some of these," she said, setting them on the small table beside the swing. "Consider it a thank you for fixing my screen door last week, Eli." "You don't need to thank me for that, Margaret," Eli protested, but she was already waving off his words. "Nonsense. That's what community means," she said firmly, then headed back to her garden, humming as she went. Maya reached for a cookie, breaking it in half and offering part to Eli. "She's right, you know, about community." The swing creaked again as they shared the cookie, watching the sun sink lower in the sky. In the distance, the plant's steady hum seemed to harmonize with the evening sounds. Crickets beginning their nightly chorus, children being called in for dinner, car doors closing as people returned home from work. A group of teenagers walked past, heading toward the community center with welding aprons slung over their shoulders. They were part of the new vocational program, another piece of the future they'd all built together. "I never thought I'd say this," Maya mused. "But I'm actually grateful for that car accident now. Not for the accident itself, of course, but for where it led us, for what it helped us build." Eli squeezed her hand gently. "Sometimes the best things come from the hardest moments," he said, thinking of all the twists and turns that had brought them here, "though I have to admit I could have done with a few less dramatic ways of getting to know you." Maya laughed, the sound mixing with another creak from the swing. "Well, you've always had a flair for the dramatic rescue, Eli Gardner." The streetlights began to flicker on, one by one, casting warm pools of light along the sidewalk. The last children reluctantly headed inside, their parents' calls for dinner finally winning out over the appeal of play. The plant's hum seemed to soften with the approaching night, becoming just another part of the town's evening symphony. Above them, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Maya snuggled closer to Eli's side, and together they watched their town settle into the peaceful rhythms of another evening, a town that had faced its challenges and emerged stronger, a community that had chosen conscience over convenience, and neighbors who had learned that the strongest foundations are built on mercy, courage, and the simple act of standing together. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's emergency room cast harsh shadows as Eli hunched over a clipboard, his work-roughened hands carefully filling out witness statements. His shirt still smelled of smoke, and traces of soot marked his forearms where he'd crawled through the wreckage to reach the trapped woman. Two nurses whispered urgently at the nearby station, their voices carrying just enough for him to catch fragments. "That's Charlotte Hale," the first nurse said in hushed tones. "The philanthropist." "The billionaire's bride? To be?" her colleague responded, eyes widening. Eli's pen paused mid-sentence. The woman he'd pulled from the wreck was engaged to Trent Kincaid? The same developer who'd been pressuring to buy out Gardner's garage and half of downtown Riverbend? "Eli?" A familiar voice drew his attention. Pastor Ruth Alvarez approached, her hospital volunteer badge catching the overhead light. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled back in its usual neat bun, and concern creased her kind face. "I came as soon as I heard about the accident." "Pastor Ruth." Eli stood, stretching his stiff muscles. "Did you know who she was?" She nodded gravely. "Charlotte Hale. Everyone calls her Lottie. She runs the Hale Foundation's charitable programs." Pastor Ruth's dark eyes studied him carefully. "And yes, she's engaged to Trent Kincaid." Before Eli could respond, commotion erupted near the emergency room entrance. A cluster of reporters had gathered, their cameras flashing through the glass doors. A security guard tried to wave them back, but more pressed forward, shouting questions. "This isn't good," Pastor Ruth muttered. "That poor girl needs rest, not a media circus." A nurse hurried over to them. "Mr. Gardner, Miss Hale is awake and asking for you." Eli followed the nurse to a curtained bay where Lottie lay, looking small and vulnerable in the hospital bed. Her designer clothes had been replaced with a plain gown, and butterfly bandages held together a cut above her right eyebrow. When she saw Eli, relief flooded her face. "You saved my life," she whispered, her voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. "Anyone would have done the same," Eli replied quietly. Lottie's fingers twisted in the hospital blanket. "Please, don't tell Trent I'm here." "Not yet." Fear flickered in her eyes. "I can't deal with his PR team and camera crews right now." Pastor Ruth stepped forward. "The media's already outside, dear. They know you're here." Lottie struggled to sit up, wincing. "I have to leave. I can't stay here." "Ma'am, you should remain under observation," the nurse protested. "I'll sign whatever forms you need," Lottie insisted, "but I'm leaving." Pastor Ruth touched Eli's arm gently. "She needs a safe place for the night. Somewhere quiet, away from prying eyes." Eli ran a hand through his hair, thinking of his modest farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The guest room hadn't been used since his sister's visit last Christmas, but it was clean and comfortable. Still, taking in Trent Kincaid's fiancée seemed like asking for trouble. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. It was Maddie. "Dad, it's all over social media about the accident. Is she really Lottie Hale? Is she okay?" "She's awake," Eli texted back. "But the press is swarming." Maddie's reply was immediate. "We can't just leave her there. Our guest room is perfect. No one would think to look for her at our place." Eli looked at Lottie, saw the exhaustion and fear in her face, and made his decision. "I have a spare room," he said quietly. "No reporters, no cameras, just peace and quiet." Tears welled in Lottie's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. The next hour passed in a blur of discharge paperwork and careful planning. Pastor Ruth helped Lottie change into scrubs borrowed from the nurses' lounge. Security agreed to create a diversion at the main entrance while Eli brought his pickup around to the service entrance. When everything was ready, Eli supported Lottie as she walked slowly through the hospital's back corridors, Pastor Ruth leading the way. The service entrance opened onto a dimly lit parking area where Eli's trusted blue pickup waited. A light drizzle had started to fall, beating on the truck's windshield. Eli helped Lottie into the passenger seat, noticing how she trembled slightly from exhaustion. Pastor Ruth squeezed Lottie's hand through the window. "You'll be safe with Eli," she assured her. "He's one of the good ones." Eli started the engine and eased the truck out of the parking lot. His headlights cut through the misty darkness as they drove away from the hospital, leaving the chaos of reporters and cameras behind. In the passenger seat, Lottie leaned back and closed her eyes, some of the tension finally leaving her shoulders. The rain picked up as they headed toward the outskirts of town, the steady rhythm of the wipers marking their quiet journey through the night. Neither spoke, but the silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. Eli kept his eyes on the road, wondering what twist of fate had brought the fiancée of his biggest rival into his truck and under his protection. The warm, comforting aroma of melted cheese and tomato soup filled the farmhouse kitchen. Maddie moved confidently between stove and counter, her dark curls pulled back in a messy bun as she flipped perfectly golden grilled cheese sandwiches in the cast-iron skillet. The familiar sounds of butter sizzling and soup bubbling created a cozy atmosphere that seemed to push away the chaos of the evening. Lottie sat at the worn wooden table, looking small in Maddie's borrowed Texas A&M sweatshirt and track pants. Her designer clothes, smoke-damaged and torn from the accident, lay forgotten in a bag by the door. Despite the butterfly bandage on her forehead and the way she held herself carefully to avoid jarring her bruised ribs, she managed a genuine smile as Maddie set a steaming bowl of soup in front of her. "Dad always says there's nothing a good grilled cheese can't fix," Maddie said, sliding plates onto the table. "Well, that and WD-40, but I figured the sandwich was more appropriate." Lottie laughed softly, then winced. "Your dad seems like a wise man." "He has his moments." Maddie dropped into the chair across from their guest. "Welcome to the Gardner home for wayward souls. We're kind of the safe house for strays and saints around here." She grinned. "Though you're our first, Almost billionaire? Maddie, Eli warned gently, taking his seat. Sorry, Maddie said, not looking sorry at all. But you have to admit, it's not every day we rescue someone famous. I'm hardly famous, Lottie protested, carefully picking up half a sandwich. I just work for the foundation. And you're engaged to Trent Kincaid, Maddie pointed out. The guy trying to buy out half of Main Street. A shadow crossed Lottie's face. She set the sandwich down, her fingers trembling slightly. Actually, I was driving out to tell Trent I can't marry him when the crash happened. The kitchen went quiet, except for the soft tick of the old wall clock. Eli remained silent, his steady presence offering a safe space for her to continue, or not, as she chose. Lottie stared into her soup bowl as if it held answers. The redevelopment plans, they're not what people think. The community center where Mrs. Pearl runs her youth programs? It'll be torn down for luxury condos. The black-owned barbershop that's been on Main Street for 3 generations? The rent will triple. And the seniors in the apartment complex by the park? She shook her head. They'll all be priced out within a year. But that's not right, Maddie protested. Those places are part of who we are. I know. Lottie's voice was barely above a whisper. I've tried talking to Trent about it. About including protections for existing businesses, about setting aside affordable units. He smiles and makes promises, but nothing changes on paper. It's all about maximizing profit margins. Eli broke off a piece of his sandwich, considering his words carefully. Sometimes doing the right thing means walking away from what looks good on paper. Lottie met his eyes, finding no judgment there, just quiet understanding. Even if it costs you everything? Especially then. He didn't elaborate, but his gaze held steady. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the simple meal somehow tasting better for being shared. Maddie told funny stories about the local high school drama club's latest production, carefully avoiding any mention of crashes or development plans. When the kitchen was cleaned up, with Lottie insisting on helping despite Maddie's protests, Eli showed their guests to the spare room. It was simple but comfortable, with a handmade quilt on the bed and curtains that Eli's late wife had sewn. Bathroom's down the hall, he said. Maddie left some clean towels and things on the dresser. If you need anything, just knock on my door across the way. Thank you, Lottie said softly, for everything. I know taking in a stranger isn't exactly. You're not a stranger anymore, he interrupted gently. You're someone who needed help. That's all that matters. After he left, Lottie stood at the window, looking out at the old red barn, illuminated by the warm glow of the porch lamp. The familiar structure seemed to stand as a testament to simpler times, when a person's word was their bond, and communities looked out for their own. In his own room, Eli sat on the edge of his bed, turning the small velvet box over in his hands. He'd found it clutched in Lottie's hand at the crash site, and though he knew what it likely contained, he hadn't opened it. Some things weren't meant for his eyes. He placed it carefully on his nightstand, a silent reminder of the weight of choices yet to be made. Early morning sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Eli moved quietly through his morning routine, the coffee maker gurgling softly as he pulled down 3 mugs from the cabinet. The house still held that peaceful stillness that came before everyone else stirred. He glanced at his phone, 6:15 a.m. Enough time to check on their unexpected guest car before taking Maddie to school. The coffee maker finished with a final sputter, and the rich aroma filled the kitchen just as footsteps creaked overhead. "Morning, Dad," Maddie said, shuffling into the kitchen in her soccer practice clothes, her hair still messy from sleep. She made a beeline for the coffee pot. "Since when do you drink coffee?" Eli raised an eyebrow. "Since I have morning practice and a calculus test today." She poured a cup and dumped in enough cream and sugar to make it barely recognizable as coffee anymore. "I need to run an errand before I drop you off," Eli said, keeping his voice low. "Pete called. They towed Miss Hale's car to the yard last night." Maddie nodded, understanding in her eyes. At 16, she picked up on more than most people gave her credit for. You want to check it out before the insurance people get there? Just want to make sure everything's documented properly, Eli said, though they both knew there was more to it than that. 20 years as a mechanic had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about that crash hadn't sat right with him. The sound of another door opening upstairs made them both look up. "I left some clean clothes outside the bathroom for Ms. Hale," Maddie whispered. "Some of Mom's old things I found in the cedar chest." Eli squeezed her shoulder, grateful not for the first time for his daughter's thoughtful heart. The sun was barely over the horizon when Eli pulled into Pete's towing storage. The lot was empty except for Pete's ancient blue heeler, who thumped his tail in greeting. "Morning, Blue," Eli said, patting the dog's head as Pete emerged from the office. "She's over there." Pete jerked his thumb toward the back lot. "Figured you'd want to take a look before the vultures descended." The luxury sedan sat like a crumpled piece of paper under the early morning light, its sleek lines twisted and charred. Eli circled it slowly, his trained eye taking in every detail. The impact damage told a clear story. She'd gone off the road at high speed, with no signs of braking. He crouched down, using his phone's flashlight to examine the undercarriage. There, just behind the master cylinder. His breath caught as he spotted the clean cut in the brake line, too precise to be accident or wear. "Pete," he called, "got your camera handy?" Pete wordlessly handed over his digital camera, and Eli carefully documented everything: the cut line, the angle, the lack of corrosion that would indicate natural failure. His hands were steady, but his heart raced. This wasn't an accident. Someone had wanted Lottie Hale dead. Back at the house, Lottie sat at the kitchen table in Sarah Gardner's old sundress, looking both elegant and vulnerable as she stared at her silent phone. A stack of toast sat untouched on the plate before her. 15 missed calls, she said without looking up. 28 text messages, all from Trent's people. She scrolled through them. "Where are you? The foundation needs a statement. Mr. Kincaid is concerned." Her laugh held no humor. "He's not concerned about me. He's concerned about control." "You don't have to respond to any of them," Eli said, pouring her a fresh cup of coffee. "I know." She wrapped her hands around the warm mug. "But they won't stop. Trent doesn't like loose ends." Maddie rushed through, grabbing her backpack. "Late for practice, Dad." "Keys are in my jacket," he told her. "I'll be right there." As Maddie clattered out the door, Lottie's phone buzzed again. This time, her face went pale as she read the screen. "What is it?" Eli asked. She turned the phone so he could see the news article that had just popped up. The headline read, "Questions arise about Small, town mechanic's role in Eris's disappearance." Eli scanned the article, his jaw tightening. The piece was carefully worded to avoid outright accusations, but the implications were clear. It painted him as an opportunist who might be taking advantage of a vulnerable woman after her accident. It mentioned his struggling business, his status as a widowed single father, and sources close to the situation who questioned his motives in taking Lottie to his home instead of the hospital. "I'm so sorry," Lottie whispered. "This is exactly what he does. He finds pressure points and he pushes them. Your reputation, your business, your role as a father, he'll use it all." "Dad?" Maddie stood in the doorway, car keys in hand. She'd seen the article too. He could tell by the way her shoulders had tensed. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said firmly. "Get to practice. We'll sort this out." After Maddie left, silence filled the kitchen. Lottie stared at the article on her phone screen, her fingers white-knuckled around the device. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" she said quietly. "He won't stop here." "No," Eli agreed, thinking of the cut brake line and what it meant. "I don't believe he will." Lottie set the phone down on the kitchen table, the screen still glowing with the damaging article. Her voice was steady, despite the fear in her eyes. "I never wanted to drag anyone else into this, especially not you and Maddie." The church basement hummed with quiet activity as volunteers moved between metal shelves stocked with canned goods and dry staples. Pastor Ruth stood at a folding table, directing traffic with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. Soup goes on the left, beans on the right, she called out, marking items off a clipboard. And remember, folks, check those expiration dates. Lottie hung back near the stairs, arms wrapped around herself. The borrowed sweater from Maddie felt soft against her skin, a comfort in this unfamiliar space. Eli gave her a gentle nod as he carried a heavy box past. First time volunteering? A warm voice drew her attention. Mrs. Pearl Washington stood beside her, dark eyes twinkling with kindness. The elderly woman's silver hair was wrapped in a colorful scarf, and she wore a hand-sewn apron covered in bright patches. That obvious, huh? Lottie managed a small smile. We were all new once, Mrs. Pearl said. Come on, I'll show you the ropes. They started with simple tasks, checking dates, organizing shelves. Lottie watched as people came and went. Veterans still wearing their service caps, widows clutching worn canvas bags, young mothers bouncing babies on their hips. Each person got a warm greeting from the volunteers, often by name. Mr. Johnson, Maddie called out from where she was stocking cans. How's that garden coming along? An elderly man in a faded denim jacket grinned. Those tomato plants you gave me are growing like weeds, Miss Maddie. You'll have to come by for some fresh sauce soon. Lottie noticed how Eli seemed to know everyone's story. He helped a veteran with a cane-load groceries into his truck, their heads bent together in quiet conversation. When a young mother looked overwhelmed, trying to juggle her toddler and her food box, he swooped in to help, making the little one giggle with silly faces. That man's got a heart bigger than Texas, Mrs. Pearl commented, following Lottie's gaze. Come with me, dear. I want to show you something special. She led Lottie to a small room off the main basement. Hanging on the wall was an intricate quilt, its patches forming a complex pattern of blues, browns, and deep reds. This here's our freedom quilt, Mrs. Pearl said softly. Started it back in '65, right after segregation ended. See these stitches? She traced a line of careful handiwork. That's from my mama. And these? Her finger moved to another section. Miss Betty Wilson. She was the first white lady to invite us to her church social. Lottie leaned closer, seeing the hundreds of tiny stitches that held the piece together. It's beautiful. It's more than pretty fabric, child. Every stitch tells a story of this town coming together. Black folks, white folks, everybody in between, we all put something into this quilt. Mrs. Pearl's voice held both pride and memory. When they tried to keep the community pool segregated, it was Miss Betty who stood with us. When my brother couldn't get a loan for his barber shop, Mr. Gardner, Eli's daddy, co-signed for him. Lottie thought of the development plans sitting on Trent's desk, with their sterile architectural renderings and projected profit margins. None of them showed the barber shop that had stood on Main Street for 3 generations, or the community center where seniors gathered for meals and companionship. Girl, Mrs. Pearl said, reading her expression, love is the only fabric that doesn't fray. Everything else, money, power, fancy buildings, that all wears thin eventually. But when people stitch their hearts together, she patted the quilt. That holds. Back in the main room, Lottie worked alongside Maddie, learning the system for organizing donations. She met Mr. Washington, who'd been cutting hair in the same shop for 40 years. She helped Mrs. Steckier, Chen, who taught piano lessons to half the town's children, pick out ingredients for her famous dumplings that she shared at every church potluck. Each person had a story, each one was a thread in the town's tapestry. As the afternoon wound down, Pastor Ruth found Lottie organizing the last box of donations. Thank you for helping today, she said. Sometimes we need to see with our hearts what our eyes miss. Lottie nodded, unable to find words for the weight in her chest, not grief now, but something closer to purpose. Later that evening, while Eli worked late at the garage catching up on repairs, Lottie and Maddie sat at the kitchen table. Steam rose from their mugs of hot cocoa, and Maddie's laughter filled the room as she described her latest welding mishap. And then the spark flew right up, she demonstrated with her hands, and I jumped so high I knocked over the whole cart of tools. She grinned. Dad just stood there shaking his head, trying not to laugh. He seems good at that, Keeping calm when things go sideways, Lottie said, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. Yeah, Maddie's voice softened. After Mom died, he never let me see him break down, but I'd hear him sometimes, late at night, praying in the garage. He'd work on cars until dawn, like fixing them could fix everything else. She stirred her cocoa thoughtfully. But he taught me that broken things don't have to stay broken. Sometimes they come back stronger where they've been mended. Lottie thought of the Freedom Quilt, its pieces joined by countless careful stitches, each one an act of hope. She thought of the garage, where Eli helped people piece their lives back together one repair at a time. Your dad's pretty special, she said quietly. Yeah, Maddie agreed, then grinned mischievously. But don't tell him that. His head barely fits through the door as it is. Their laughter echoed in the warm kitchen, sweet as the cocoa they shared, while outside the stars winked over a town held together by threads of love and courage, old promises and new hopes, all woven into something stronger than steel. The morning sun streamed through Eli's kitchen windows, casting warm squares of light across the wooden table where Lottie sat with a notepad. The smell of fresh coffee mingled with toast as Maddie slid into the chair beside her, peering at the growing list of bullet points. So, what exactly goes into one of these agreements? Maddie asked, pulling her long brown hair into a ponytail. Lottie tapped her pen against the paper. It's like a promise between a developer and the community. We outline what the town needs to stay healthy, protecting local shops, creating jobs, keeping rent affordable for seniors. Eli leaned against the counter, coffee mug in hand. His weathered face showed concern. Sounds good on paper, but will Trent even look at it? He has to, Lottie said, straightening her shoulders. The Hale Foundation's support carries weight, and public opinion matters to him, even if he won't admit it. Maddie grabbed her laptop from her backpack. I can help format this. We learned about professional documents in business class last semester. Look at you. Eli smiled proudly at his daughter. Already putting that education to work. They spent the next hour shaping the agreement. Lottie's philanthropy experience merged with Maddie's fresh perspective as they crafted each section. Eli occasionally offered practical insights from a small business owner's view. Pastor Ruth arrived mid-morning, bringing a box of donuts and her practical wisdom. She pulled up a chair, adjusting her reading glasses to review their draft. This is solid, she nodded, pointing to specific passages. We need to add language about preserving the historic barber shop. It's been black, owned for 3 generations. And maybe something about apprenticeships at local businesses? Like the garage? Maddie's eyes lit up. Dad's always saying we need more young mechanics. Eli rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Could work. Give kids a future here instead of having to leave town for opportunities. Lottie added these points, her handwriting growing more confident with each line. The agreement was taking shape. Protection for existing businesses, job training programs, affordable housing guarantees, and preservation of historic buildings. We should take this to Main Street, Pastor Ruth suggested. Let the business owners see it, get their input. They split into teams after lunch. Pastor Ruth headed to the west end of Main Street while Eli and Lottie took the east side. Maddie stayed at the kitchen table, typing up their handwritten notes into a professional document. The afternoon buzzed with energy as they moved from shop to shop. Mr. Chen at the pharmacy nodded vigorously while reading the draft. This is what we needed. Something with teeth in it. Count me in. Miss Betty at the diner signed immediately. About time somebody stood up for this town's soul, she declared, sliding them free pieces of apple pie. The Williams brothers at the hardware store took longer, asking detailed questions about enforcement. But they too eventually added their names to the growing list of supporters. By 4 o'clock, they regrouped at the church. Pastor Ruth's list of signatures matched their own. Half the town's businesses, she announced with satisfaction. That's enough to make them listen. Back at Eli's house, Maddie had transformed their rough draft into a polished document. Clean formatting, clear headers, and even a professional cover page made it look official. This is amazing, Lottie said, flipping through the pages. Her hands trembled slightly as she slid the agreement into her leather bag. The weight of what came next settled over her. Presenting this to Trent would mean confrontation. "You don't have to do this alone," Eli said quietly, reading her expression. "Yes, I do," Lottie replied, squaring her shoulders. "He needs to see I'm serious." She clutched her bag closer, the community's hopes now literally in her hands. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Eli's front porch when the courier arrived in a sleek black car. He handed Lottie a thick manila envelope with gold embossing, then drove away, leaving a trail of dust on the gravel driveway. Lottie's hands trembled as she broke the seal. The document inside was heavy, printed on expensive paper with that distinctive legal watermark. She settled into the porch swing, its gentle creak matching her racing heartbeat as she began to read. Page after page, detailed financial arrangements, property divisions, and corporate protections. But it was Section 7.3 that made her breath catch. The words seemed to burn off the page. In the event the party materially harms or impedes any Kincaid development project, all philanthropic rights and designated charitable assets shall be immediately forfeit. The implications hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just about money, it was about her life's work. The foundation seat she'd used to fund women's shelters, veteran programs, and youth education could be stripped away with a signature. Eli appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a shop rag. One look at her face, and he knew something was wrong. "Bad news?" Lottie handed him the document, pointing to the clause. He read it slowly, his expression darkening. "That's quite a chain they're trying to put on you. If I speak out against the development or support the CBA, I lose everything I've built." Her voice cracked. "All the programs, all the people who depend on that funding." Eli settled onto the swing beside her, its weathered chains groaning softly. "Mind if I share something I learned fixing engines?" Lottie gestured for him to continue, grateful for his steady presence. "When you're working with machinery, there's always a temptation to over-tighten. People think harder means stronger." He mimed, turning a wrench. "But push too far, and you strip the thread completely. Then you've lost more than just the part you were trying to fix, you've compromised the whole system." She let his words sink in, watching a pair of cardinals flit between the oak trees. "You think that's what Trent's doing? Trying to tighten his control until something breaks?" "I think," Eli said carefully, "sometimes people confuse power with strength. Real strength knows when to hold firm and when to give." Lottie stood and paced the worn boards of the porch. "The foundation helps thousands of people every year. Food banks, medical assistance, educational scholarships." She pressed her hands against the porch railing. "How can I justify risking all that? Maybe the question so many more will suffer if nobody stands up to these tactics." Eli's voice was gentle but firm. "Sometimes doing right means losing something precious." The weight of the decision pressed down on her shoulders. Through the screen door, she could hear Maddie humming while doing homework at the kitchen table. The simple sound of normal life continuing while her world tilted on its axis. "I need time to think," she said finally. Eli nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Take all the time you need. Just remember, you don't have to carry this alone." As evening settled over the farmhouse, Lottie retreated to the guest room, the prenup lying heavy on the bedside table. She changed into borrowed pajamas, the soft cotton, a stark contrast to her usual silk sleepwear. The night was alive with cricket song and the distant whisper of wind in the trees. She lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at shadows on the ceiling, her mind racing through scenarios. Every path seemed to lead to loss, either her ability to help through the foundation or her own integrity. The foundation's faces flashed through her mind. Maria at the women's shelter who'd finally gotten her nursing degree, old Mr. Chen whose heart medication was covered by their emergency fund, the veterans who'd found purpose in their job training program. Could she abandon them all for a principle? But then again, could she live with herself if she didn't stand up against this kind of manipulation? The crickets chirped steadily outside her window, nature's metronome marking time as she wrestled with her conscience. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the fields, free and lonesome in the Texas night. Rolling onto her side, Lottie watched moonlight filter through the lace curtains, making patterns on the hardwood floor. The question that had been building all day finally crystallized in her mind. Was she strong enough to risk everything she'd built for what she knew was right? The night offered no easy answers, only the steady chorus of crickets and the weight of a choice that would change everything. The Saturday morning sun painted the town in golden light as pickup trucks and old sedans lined up outside Gardner's garage. Eli had opened the big bay doors wide, letting fresh air and sunshine flood the workspace. The smell of coffee and fresh-baked goods wafted from a folding table where neighbors had dropped off breakfast treats. Lottie stood at the entrance, clipboard in hand, organizing the day's repair schedule. She wore jeans and a borrowed mechanic's shirt, with Gardner's Garage stitched above the pocket. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and engine grease already smudged her cheek. "Mrs. Rodriguez, we'll get to your Buick next," she called out to an elderly woman sitting in a lawn chair. "Can I get you some more coffee while you wait?" Inside the garage, Eli knelt beside a lifted Chevy, showing Tom Wilson, a Vietnam veteran with weathered hands and careful eye show to check brake pads. "See how the wear indicator's almost touching? That's when you know it's time," Eli explained, his voice patient and steady. Tom nodded, adjusting his glasses. "Wish I'd known this years ago. Could have saved some money." "Never too late to learn," Eli smiled, handing Tom the wrench. "Your turn now." Maddie worked in her own corner of the garage, making final adjustments to something hidden under a blue tarp. The periodic spark of her welding torch drew curious glances from the children playing tag between parked cars. Local reporter Sarah Chen from the county newspaper moved through the crowd, snapping photos and collecting quotes. "This is what community looks like," she murmured, capturing a shot of 3 generations grandmother, mother, and daughter sharing a slice of peach pie on the tailgate of a pickup. By mid-morning the crowd had grown. Pastor Ruth arrived with another pot of coffee and a box of donuts. Mrs. Brout, Pearl Washington, set up her lawn chair near the garage entrance, holding court and sharing stories about the town's history with anyone who'd listen. "Y'all watch this," Maddie announced around noon, standing proud beside her covered creation. The crowd gathered as she gripped the tarp. "For the community center lawn," she pulled the cover away with a flourish. Gasps and applause erupted. There stood a life-size bluebonnet sculpture, each petal and leaf crafted from salvaged metal, welded together with extraordinary detail. The afternoon light caught the blue-tinted steel, making it shimmer like a real flower caught in spring sunshine. "Oh, Maddie," Lottie breathed, moving closer to admire the work. "It's beautiful." Eli watched his daughter beam with pride, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "That's my girl," he said softly. The day continued with a steady rhythm of repairs, conversation, and community. Children drew chalk pictures on the concrete, veterans swapped stories over coffee, and elderly neighbors caught up on gossip while waiting for their cars. Around 4 o'clock, clouds rolled in, bringing a gentle spring shower. The tin roof of the garage amplified the peaceful patter of raindrops. Most folks had headed home, leaving just a few cars waiting for final checks. The radio on Eli's workbench played softly an old gospel station. The opening notes of "Amazing Grace" filled the space between raindrops. Lottie stood by the office door, watching the rain and humming along. Eli wiped his hands on a shop rag and walked over to her. "May I?" he asked quietly, holding out his hand. Lottie smiled and took it. There in the garage, surrounded by tools and the sweet smell of rain, they began to slow dance. Their shadows stretched long across the concrete floor, cast by the warm shop lights. The moment felt suspended in Timeno prenups, no corporate battles, no complicated choices. Just 2 people swaying to an old hymn while rain played percussion on the roof. Maddie sat on a workbench, legs swinging, watching them with a soft smile. She didn't tease or make jokes, she just let them have this moment of grace. The song ended, but the rain continued its gentle rhythm. Outside, puddles reflected the golden glow from the garage windows, creating warm pools of light in the gathering dusk. The wet pavement shimmered, and the newly washed air carried the scent of spring earth and hope. Lottie stepped back slightly, but kept hold of Eli's hand. They stood together, in comfortable silence, watching the rain slow to a drizzle as the day's last light painted the clouds in gentle pinks and purples. Through the open bay doors, they could see Maddie's bluebonnet sculpture on its trailer, ready for installation at the community center. Water droplets clung to its petals, making it glisten like morning dew on a real flower. The garage lights cast a warm glow against the damp evening, turning the ordinary repair shop into something that felt like sanctuary. For this one moment, everything seemed possible, every hope, every dream, every prayer. The high school gymnasium buzzed with nervous energy as townspeople filed in, filling the bleachers and folding chairs. The familiar scent of floor wax and old wood brought memories of pep rallies and graduation ceremonies, but tonight's gathering held far more weight. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across worried faces. Lottie sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wore a simple blue dress, her engagement ring feeling heavier with each passing minute. Beside her, Maddie squeezed her hand, while Pastor Ruth sat quietly, praying 2 seats down. Mayor Thompson stood at the podium, his voice echoing through the packed space. Tonight we're here to discuss the proposed redevelopment plan for our downtown area. First, we'll hear from Kincaid Development's representatives. A murmur rippled through the crowd as Trent's lawyers, sharp in their designer suits, presented glossy renderings of glass-fronted buildings and projected revenue charts. Their words were smooth, practiced, promising progress and prosperity. When they finished, Mayor Thompson cleared his throat. Next, we'll hear from Eli Gardner. Eli rose slowly from his seat, straightening his clean work shirt. His boots echoed on the hardwood as he walked to the microphone. He didn't have fancy slides or practice speeches. Instead, he pulled out a worn leather wallet. "Folks," he began, his voice quiet but clear, "I learned about triage as an Army medic. It's about deciding who needs help first, when there's too much need and not enough time." He opened his wallet and held up an old photo. "This is Mrs. Pearl's grandfather's barbershop, been on Main Street since 1932. Next door is Rodriguez Hardware, where 3 generations have helped folks fix their homes." He paused, looking across the familiar faces. "In triage, you protect the most vulnerable first. The ones who can't wait, who might not survive without immediate care. Our elderly neighbors on fixed incomes, our veteran-owned businesses, our historic buildings that tell our story. They're who need protection first." Lottie stood up, moving to stand beside him. Her heart pounded, but her voice remained steady. "Mr. Mayor, I'd like to speak." The mayor nodded, and Lottie stepped forward. She could feel Trent's lawyers watching her intently, their phones probably already alerting their client. "I'm Charlotte Hale," she began, though everyone knew who she was by now. "For the past week, I've restocked food pantry shelves with your church volunteers. I've heard your stories over coffee at May's Diner. I've watched children play in front of homes their great-grandparents built." She reached for the ring on her finger. "I came to this town by accident. Quite literally. But what I found here was no accident. I found people who understand that true prosperity isn't about the height of our buildings, but the strength of our connections." The velvet box from her wrecked car sat in her purse. She pulled it out now, her hand steady. "This ring represents a partnership I can no longer support, not because of any lack of feeling, but because of conscience." A collective gasp filled the gym as she placed her engagement ring in the box. "The Hale Foundation pledges to fund repairs for our community center, but only if Kincaid Development agrees to a community benefits agreement that protects our most vulnerable neighbors." The crowd erupted. Some people stood, clapping. Others wiped tears. Mrs. Pearl's voice rang out with a clear, "Amen!" Mayor Thompson had to bang his gavel several times to restore order. When the noise settled, Eli spoke again, his voice even quieter than before. "We're not asking for charity, we're asking for partnership. Real partnership, where everyone's dignity stays intact." He gestured to Maddie, who brought forward copies of the Community Benefits Agreement. "We've outlined fair terms, apprenticeships for our youth, preservation of historic businesses, and a rent stability fund for our seniors." Lottie watched Trent's lawyers hurriedly texting, their faces tight with controlled panic. She felt surprisingly calm, even as she recognized the magnitude of what she'd just done. The next hour passed in a blur of testimonies. Veterans spoke about Eli's help keeping their trucks running. Elderly residents described their fears of being priced out of homes they'd lived in for decades. Young people talked about wanting to stay in their hometown while building their futures. When the meeting finally adjourned, people lingered in small groups, talking excitedly. The energy felt electric, hopeful. For a moment, it seemed like David had truly stood up to Goliath, and won. Eli found Lottie near the gym doors where cool night air drifted in. "Need a ride home?" She nodded, suddenly exhausted but peaceful. They walked to his truck in comfortable silence, the gravel crunching under their feet. The night sky stretched vast above them as they drove, stars twinkling like distant promises. Neither spoke for several minutes, both processing the evening's events. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the familiar road to Eli's farmhouse where Lottie was still staying. At a stoplight, Eli finally broke the silence. "You did a brave thing tonight." Lottie looked down at her bare finger, then out at the sleeping town. "We did a necessary thing." The truck rumbled on through the quiet streets, carrying them home under a canopy of stars. They both sat with their thoughts, wondering if tonight's victory would hold, or if it was just the opening move in a much larger battle. The morning sun hadn't yet burned through the fog when Eli pulled into Gardner's garage. He slowed his truck, frowning at the unfamiliar black SUV parked in front. Two men in suits stood by his shop's entrance, and a heavy chain with a padlock wrapped around the front door handles. "What's going on here?" Eli stepped out of his truck, work boots crunching on loose gravel. The taller suit held up a badge. "Mr. Gardner, I'm Inspector Davis from Environmental Compliance. We've received reports of potential hazardous waste violations." "Violations?" Eli's voice remained steady, though his heart pounded. "We follow every regulation. I have all the documentation, which we'll review thoroughly during our audit." Davis handed him a thick envelope. "Until then, operations are suspended. You can't open for business until you're cleared." Eli's scarred hands gripped the paperwork. 20 years of careful work, of teaching Maddie about honest service, of keeping his prices fair for folks on fixed incomes, all stopped by a chain and a piece of paper. "How long will the audit take?" he asked. "Hard to say. Could be weeks, maybe months." The second suit smirked slightly. "Depends how cooperative everyone is." They left Eli standing in the fog, watching his customers arrive only to turn away confused. He spent the morning making apologetic phone calls, especially to Mrs. Prox. Pearl, whose car needed new brake pads, and to the veteran who'd scheduled transmission work. By early afternoon, he sat at his kitchen table surrounded by logbooks and receipts, methodically documenting every oil change and parts disposal. Lottie helped sort papers while Maddie worked on homework. The doorbell rang. A woman in a crisp blazer stood on the porch, holding a tablet. "Mr. Gardner? I'm Sandra Martinez from Child Protective Services. We've received some concerning reports about your household situation." Eli's stomach dropped, but he kept his voice calm. "Please, come in." Miss Martinez settled onto their worn couch, her pen poised over forms. "We have multiple anonymous complaints about you bringing an unknown woman into your home with your teenage daughter present. There are also allegations of exposing your child to unstable situations and potential danger." Maddie, who'd followed them into the living room, burst out, "That's not true. Dad's the most careful person I know." "Maddie," Eli said softly, "please let me handle this." Lottie stood in the kitchen doorway, her face pale. She watched as Eli answered questions about his work schedule, Maddie's schooling, their support system. He spoke with the same patient dignity he used when explaining repairs to nervous customers. "And Ms. Hale's presence here?" Ms. Martinez asked. "Can you explain that situation?" "I helped her after a car accident," Eli said simply. "She needed a safe place to recover." The social worker made notes, her expression neutral. "I'll need to speak with Maddie alone and schedule a home inspection." Given the nature of the complaints, we'll need to move quickly on this review." After she left, Eli sat heavily in his armchair, running a hand over his face. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper, but his voice remained steady when he spoke. "Maddie, why don't you go work on your welding project in the garage? I need to make some calls." Once Maddie reluctantly left, Lottie moved to perch on the arm of his chair. "Eli, I'm so sorry. This is Trent's doing. The audit, the CPS complaint, all of it." "I know." He looked up at her, and despite the hurt in his eyes, she saw the same quiet strength that had drawn her to him. "But we're not backing down. This town needs someone to stand up to bullies who think money can buy the right to hurt people." Lottie's phone buzzed. Another message from the Hale Foundation board. She opened it and felt her throat tighten. "What is it?" Eli asked. "Major donors are threatening to pull their funding." Her voice shook slightly. "They're demanding I make a public statement about my mental stability and retract my concerns about the development project." Eli reached for her hand, his calloused palm warm against her fingers. "You don't owe them false words to keep their money." "But the foundation helps so many people," Lottie whispered. "The food banks, the veteran housing program, the scholarship fund." "And you'll find other ways to help," Eli said firmly. "Ways that don't require you to lie about who you are or what you believe." They sat in silence as afternoon shadows lengthened across the floor. Outside, they could hear Maddie's welding torch firing up in the garage, the sound of creation continuing despite everything. The familiar rhythm of life in their small town carried on. Mrs. Pearl's wind chimes tinkling next door, kids riding bikes past the house, the distant whistle of the 4:30 train. Lottie's phone kept buzzing with messages from board members and donors, each one more urgent than the last. The latest one made her wince. Without immediate crisis management, annual funding projections show a 60% decrease. But as she looked around Eli's modest living room, at the family photos, Maddie's welding awards, the carefully patched armchair, she realized something. The true measure of help wasn't always in grand numbers or foundation budgets. Sometimes it was in the small, steady acts of standing beside people when they needed it most. The sun was setting when Pastor Ruth's old station wagon pulled into the driveway. She carried a casserole dish and a determined expression. "Thought you folks might need some supper?" she said, letting herself in. "And maybe a reminder that you're not alone in this fight." The news about the garage closure and the CPS investigation had spread through town like wildfire. Already, Eli's phone was filling with messages of support from customers and neighbors. Even now, he could see lights on at Mrs. Pearl's house next door, where she was undoubtedly making phone calls to rally the community. The church office felt smaller than usual that morning, with sunlight streaming through stained glass windows casting colored shadows across the worn carpet. Eli sat in one of the mismatched chairs, his shoulders heavy with the weight of yesterday's events. Pastor Ruth stood by her ancient coffee maker, the device gurgling and sputtering as it worked. "They're trying to make it look like I'm unfit," Eli said, running a hand through his graying hair. "Using the system against me just because I help someone in need." Pastor Ruth nodded, her wise eyes filled with concern. "Trent Kincaid's playing hardball, but he's forgetting something important. This community knows you, Eli. They've seen you raise Maddie into the wonderful young woman she is." The door creaked open, and Maddie stepped in, carrying a thermos. Her face brightened with a determined smile that reminded Eli so much of her mother. "Dad, I brought you some of the good coffee from home. The stuff here tastes like motor oil." She wrinkled her nose at Pastor Ruth. "No offense." "None taken," Pastor Ruth chuckled. "I've been saying that for years." Eli accepted the thermos, touched by his daughter's thoughtfulness. "Thanks, sweetheart. Shouldn't you be in class?" "It's my free period," Maddie said, perching on the arm of his chair. "And this is more important. Besides, I've got straight A's in everything except chemistry, and that's only because Mr. Peterson can't teach to save his life." Pastor Ruth pulled out a folder from her desk. "The social worker who visited Martha Chen. She's actually a member of First Methodist. I know her to be fair-minded. She's not the type to be swayed by political pressure." "That's something, at least." Eli took a sip of the coffee, letting its warmth steady him. The pastor's phone buzzed, and she checked the message. The food pantry volunteers are asking about Saturday, with the garage closed. Tell them we'll figure something out, Eli said firmly. Maybe we can set up in the church parking lot. Those families depend on those repairs. Maddie squeezed her father's shoulder. We could ask Mr. Rodriguez if we could use his lot. His shop's smaller, but it's something. Before Eli could respond, they heard quick footsteps in the hallway. Lottie appeared in the doorway, her face pale but composed. She wore simple jeans and a borrowed sweater, a far cry from her usual polished appearance, but somehow looked more genuine for it. I just got a call from Julian at the foundation, she said, closing the door behind her. Trent's making moves with the board. He's claiming I'm having some kind of breakdown and trying to push for an emergency meeting to remove me. Pastor Ruth's expression darkened. Can he do that? The bylaws are complicated. Lottie sank into an empty chair. Julian's on my side and he thinks he can delay things, but she looked at Eli apologetically. This is my fault. If I hadn't stayed. Don't, Eli cut her off gently. You did the right thing. We all did. Maddie nodded vigorously. And we have proof about the garage inspections being forged. We just need to figure out how to use it. A knock at the door made them all jump. Pastor Ruth's secretary poked her head in. Sorry to interrupt, but there's a courier here insisting on personal delivery. A young man in a crisp uniform stepped in, holding an elegant cream-colored envelope. Miss Charlotte Hale? His eyes darted between the women until Lottie raised her hand. That's me. He handed her the envelope with a slight bow and departed. Lottie turned the heavy paper over in her hands, running her finger along the gold embossing. The Founders Gala, she read aloud, her voice tight. Trent's hosting it at the Valley View Country Club next weekend. He's going to announce the final phase of the redevelopment project. She pulled out the invitation, a small card falling from it. Her eyes scanned the handwritten note, and her jaw clenched. He says my presence would demonstrate unity and proper perspective to the community. A victory lap, Pastor Ruth said grimly. Making sure everyone sees you back in line. Eli watched Lottie's face, seeing the struggle there. The invitation trembled slightly in her hands, hands that had recently stocked food pantry shelves and helped Mrs. Pearl organize her receipts for tax time. Hands that had found new purpose in simple service. What are you thinking? He asked quietly. Lottie set the invitation on Pastor Ruth's desk like it might burn her. I'm thinking about Mrs. Pearl's quilt, about how some things don't fray. She looked around at their concerned faces. And I'm thinking maybe it's time to do more than just say no to Trent. Maybe it's time to show everyone exactly why. Maddie straightened, her eyes bright with understanding. You mean go to the gala, but not the way he wants? This could be dangerous, Pastor Ruth cautioned. Trent's already shown how far he'll go. Which is exactly why we can't let him win, Lottie said. She reached for her phone, then hesitated. Julian should be able to get us the documentation we need about the Foundation's true financial impact in communities like ours. If we can compare that to what happens after Trent's developments. A noise in the hallway made them all fall silent. When it passed, Eli leaned forward. Whatever you decide, you're not doing it alone. This stopped being just your fight when they padlocked my garage. Our garage, Maddie corrected, making Eli smile despite everything. Pastor Ruth looked at each of them in turn, then nodded slowly. I'll make some calls. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. She picked up the invitation, studying the elegant script. The Lord works in mysterious ways, but sometimes He's pretty direct about showing us which path to take. The morning light shifted, casting the room in deeper colors. The invitation gleamed on the desk, both a threat and a promise, while outside, the everyday life of Riverbend continued, unaware that the real battle for its soul was just beginning. The afternoon sun slanted through the farmhouse windows as Maddie Gardner sat cross-legged on the living room couch, her phone in her lap. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen, scrolling through social media posts she'd saved over the past few months. Dad, Ms. Lottie, come look at this, she called out, her voice tight with excitement. Eli emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel, while Lottie appeared from the guest room where she'd been making calls. They gathered around Maddie as she held up her phone. "Remember Tommy Jenkins? He works for that subcontractor company Kincaid uses," Maddie explained, pulling up a series of posts. "He's always bragging about their shortcuts." The screen showed photos of construction sites with captions that made Eli's jaw tighten. "Another quick fix to pass inspection," he read aloud. "Boss says, if it looks good on paper, that's what counts." Lottie leaned closer, her reading glasses perched on her nose. "There are dates and locations here. These match up with at least 3 of Trent's recent projects." "And look at this one," Maddie said, switching to another post. "He literally wrote, 'Who needs real inspections when you've got whiteout?'" She looked up at them. "I started saving these when I heard rumors about the senior center project." A knock at the screen door made them all jump. Mrs. Pearl Washington stood there, clutching a cardboard box filled with yellowed papers. "I heard y'all were gathering evidence," she said, her voice warm but determined. "These might help." Eli hurried to help her with the box, while Lottie cleared space on the coffee table. Mrs. Pearl settled into the armchair, smoothing her floral dress. "Town meeting minutes," she explained, pulling out stack after stack of papers. "Going back 30 years. I was town clerk's assistant back then, kept copies of everything. Call it a history teacher's habit." They spread the documents across the table. Mrs. Pearl pointed to highlighted sections, her finger tracing along the lines. "See here? 1,992. Kincaid's daddy tried the same tricks when they built that strip mall on the east side. Rushed permits, ignored community concerns." "The one that collapsed in '94? Eli asked, leaning forward. Mrs. Pearl nodded grimly. 2 people hurt. Insurance paid out. Nothing changed. She pulled out more papers. "Then in '98, same pattern with the Riverside apartments. And here, in 2005. Maddie grabbed her laptop and started organizing the information chronologically. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she created a digital timeline, combining the historical documents with the social media evidence. "We need to scan these," Lottie said, examining a particularly damning memo. "Multiple copies, stored safely." For the next few hours, they worked as a team. Maddie scanned documents while adding more social media screenshots. Mrs. Pearl provided context for each incident, her memory sharp as a tack. Eli sorted through building code violations, his experience as a mechanic helping him understand the technical details. As evening approached, Mrs. Pearl stood to leave. "Don't let him bury this truth," she said, squeezing Lottie's hand. "Some things need seeing in the light." After she left, they ordered pizza and continued working. Maddie created a presentation that would be hard to ignore, clear, factual, and devastating in its simplicity. "Look at this pattern," Eli said, pointing to the timeline on Maddie's laptop screen. The living room was lit only by table lamps now, casting a warm glow over their impromptu command center. Every few years, same story. Push through permits, cut corners, pay off problems when they arise. Lottie nodded, making notes in her precise handwriting. "And the human cost keeps rising. Those senior apartments from last year? The ones with the faulty wiring? That could have been catastrophic." "The Founders' Gala is in 3 days," Maddie reminded them, closing her laptop. "Everyone who matters in town will be there." She looked at Lottie. "It's your chance to show them who Trent really is." Eli spread the evidence across the coffee table. Mrs. Pearl's documents, Maddie's digital proof, inspection records that didn't add up. In the quiet of the night, they studied it all, knowing the weight of what lay before them. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily as Lottie and Eli sat side by side on the couch, reviewing the dossier one more time. The pizza box lay forgotten, the evidence telling a story that couldn't be ignored. Their work illuminated by the soft lamplight, they prepared for the moment that would change everything. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead in the grand ballroom of the Riverbend Hotel. Women in evening gowns and men in tuxedos mingled beneath elaborate flower arrangements, their champagne glasses catching the light. The Founders' Gala had always been the social event of the season, But tonight the air crackled with tension. Trent Kincaid stood at the podium on the raised stage, his silver hair perfectly styled, his smile practiced and bright. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests," he began, adjusting his bow tie. "Tonight marks a new chapter in Riverbend's history." "Yes, it does." Lottie's clear voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. She walked steadily toward the stage in a simple black dress, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. The room fell silent. Trent's smile flickered but held. "Ah, Charlotte, I didn't expect you to join us tonight." "I believe everyone should hear the full story of Riverbend's future," Lottie said, climbing the steps to the stage. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed a folder on the podium, but her voice remained steady. "Including the parts you've tried to keep hidden." Security guards stepped forward, but Trent waved them back, clearly not wanting to create a scene. His eyes narrowed. "This isn't the time or place for—" "I have here," Lottie continued, opening the folder, "inspection forms for the Veterans Housing Project on Oak Street. Forms that were falsified by your contractors." She held up a document. "And here are screenshots of those same contractors bragging about cutting corners to save money." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several people pulled out phones to record. "These are serious allegations," Trent said smoothly, "but surely we can discuss this privately." "I also have a letter," Lottie said, pulling out a worn piece of paper. "From James Wilson, retired Marine Corps sergeant." She began to read, "My wife and I sold our home of 30 years based on promises of priority placement in the new veterans' housing. Now we're living in our daughter's basement while the project sits unfinished because of unexpected delays. We're not alone. There are 15 other veteran families in similar situations." The crowd's whispers grew louder. Several prominent donors exchanged concerned looks. Eli Gardner stepped out from the crowd then, wearing a simple dark suit that had seen better days. He walked to the stage with quiet dignity, each step deliberate. Trent's face darkened. "Security?" "Let him speak," called Mrs. Pearl from the audience. Other voices joined hers. Eli reached the podium and stood beside Lottie. His voice was low, but carried clearly across the now silent room. "I'm not here to attack anyone," he said. "The Lord teaches us to forgive, and I do forgive the attempts to discredit me, to threaten my business, even to question my fitness as a father." He paused, his steady gaze meeting Trent's. "But forgiveness doesn't mean letting harm continue. This town deserves better. Those veterans deserve better. And you, Mr. Kincaid, are better than this." Lottie pulled out another document, the Community Benefits Agreement. "We have a solution," she said. "A legally binding agreement that protects local businesses, guarantees affordable housing, and ensures proper oversight of all construction. The majority of local business owners have already signed in support." The president of the Chamber of Commerce stepped forward from the crowd. "The board has reviewed this agreement. We find it reasonable and beneficial to all parties." "Sign it, Kincaid," someone called out. Others joined in. Trent gripped the edge of the podium, his knuckles white. "This is absurd. I don't respond to public pressure tactics." "Then you'll lose the project entirely," came a new voice. The city manager stood up from his table near the front. "The council has already voted. Either we proceed with community protections in place, or we open the bidding to other developers." Camera flashes began popping as reporters captured the moment. Trent's careful mask cracked, showing a flash of fury before smoothing into resigned calculation. He looked at the faces around him, donors, business leaders, reporters, community members, and saw the tide had turned. A gold pen appeared in Lottie's hand. She placed it, and the agreement on the podium between them. The silence stretched taut as a wire. Trent stared at the document, his jaw working. Finally, he reached for the pen. The scratching of his signature seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. More camera flashes erupted. Someone started clapping, and the applause spread like thunder through the ballroom. Lottie felt Eli's warm, steady presence beside her as they watched Trent stalk off the stage, leaving the signed agreement behind. The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across Trent's face as he stared at the document before him. His practiced smile had frozen into something brittle and sharp. Hundreds of eyes watched him, waiting, while cameras clicked in rapid succession from the press section. "This is highly irregular," he said, his voice carrying through the microphone. "These allegations need proper investigation. We can't make hasty decisions based on—" "Those inspection records aren't allegations, Mr. Kincaid." Mrs. Pearl's voice rang out clear and strong from her seat at one of the front tables. She stood slowly, straightening her spine with dignity. The purple church hat she wore caught the light as she lifted her chin. "Those are facts, just like the facts from 20 years ago when you tried this same thing in Oak Heights." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Several older attendees nodded, recognition dawning on their faces. "I remember that," called out Mr. Rodriguez, the hardware store owner. He pushed back his chair and stood. "My cousin lost his auto shop there. The environmental audit looked just like what you tried to pull on Gardner's garage." More voices joined in, a steady stream of testimony that couldn't be ignored. Pastor Ruth stepped forward, her normally gentle face set with determination. "The Community Benefits Agreement protects everyone's interests, Mr. Kincaid, including yours. A thriving town means thriving business." Lottie stood quietly by the podium, the stack of papers in her hands containing the CBA. Her face showed neither triumph nor anger, just calm certainty. Eli watched from near the stage, his work-roughened hands clasped behind his back, steady as always. The mayor cleared his throat from his seat at the head table. "The city council has reviewed the agreement. It's sound, Trent. Sign it, and let's move forward together." Trent's fingers tightened around his pen. A muscle twitched in his jaw as his gaze swept the room, likely counting votes, measuring influence, calculating costs. The moment stretched thin as a wire. "The foundations are already poured for the new development," he said, his voice harder now. "Contracts are signed. You can't simply—" "We can," said Judge Martinez, rising from his seat. "And we will. Either with you or without you, Mr. Kincaid. But it would be better for everyone if it's with you." A local news reporter called out, "Mr. Kincaid, how do you respond to the evidence of falsified safety inspections?" Another joined in, "Will you comment on the veterans' housing delays?" Sweat beaded at Trent's temple despite the ballroom's careful climate control. His eyes darted to his lawyers, huddled at a corner table, but they could only offer slight shakes of their heads. The documentation was too solid, the witnesses too credible, the moment too public. Mrs. Pearl spoke again, her voice softer now but no less firm. "You know, when my grandmother taught me to quilt, she said sometimes you have to undo all your stitches and start fresh. Ain't no shame in that. The shame is in keeping a crooked seam just 'cause you're too proud to fix it." A wave of approving murmurs swept the room. Someone started to clap, then another, and another. The sound grew like rolling thunder. Trent's shoulders stiffened. He turned to Lottie, his voice low, but caught by the microphone. "You could have handled this privately." "Like you handled the brake lines privately?" Eli's quiet words carried clearly in the sudden hush. Trent's face paled slightly, but he recovered quickly. "That's an outrageous—" "No charges were filed," Eli continued calmly. "No one's looking for revenge here, just accountability, just doing right by people who deserve better." Mayor Wilson stood now, his authority clear in his stance. "Mr. Kincaid, your signature or your withdrawal. Those are the options before us tonight." The room held its breath. Trent looked down at the agreement, then at the sea of faces before him, faces of people who had built this town with their hands and hearts, people who wouldn't back down. His mask of confidence cracked just slightly. With a sharp movement, he yanked the pen cap off. "Fine," he said tersely. "But the press release goes through my office." "The truth goes through every office," Lottie replied quietly. "That's part of the agreement, too." Trent's pen scratched across the paper, his signature bold and angry. As he straightened, camera flashes exploded around the room. The applause started slowly this time, building into solid approval. Not celebration exactly, but acknowledgement of a necessary thing done right. Pastor Ruth stepped forward to witness the signature. Judge Martinez added his own. The mayor provided the final authorization with a flourish. Relief flooded the room like a fresh breeze. People began to smile, to clasp hands, to nod at each other with satisfaction. The sound of genuine conversation and laughter started to replace the tense silence. Across the stage, Eli caught Lottie's eye. She looked tired but peaceful, the weight of weeks of worry finally lifting from her shoulders. The slight smile they shared spoke volumes. Of gratitude, of shared purpose, of quiet triumph, not over a person but for a principle. The applause continued to fill the elegant ballroom, drowning out Trent's rapid exit with his lawyers. It was the sound of a community united, of justice served without vengeance, of a future secured through courage and determination rather than force. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Gardner's garage as Eli stood in the doorway, holding the freshly printed permit reinstatement notice. The official city seal gleamed in the corner, a small victory that felt enormous after the past few weeks. He ran his thumb over the raised lettering, letting out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The familiar rumble of Mrs. Pearl's ancient station wagon drew his attention to the parking lot. She emerged carrying a massive covered casserole dish, her purple church hat tilted at its usual jaunty angle. "Don't you dare try to refuse this chicken pot pie," she called out, making her way toward him. "My grandmother's recipe has seen this town through every crisis since 1932. Eli hurried to help her with the dish. "Wouldn't dream of refusing, Mrs. Pearl, though you're the third person bringing food this morning." "Good. Means people know what matters." She patted his arm. "Where's that girl of yours?" As if on cue, the rhythmic sound of metal being buffed came from around the corner of the building. They found Maddie kneeling beside her bluebonnet sculpture, carefully working at the steel petals with polish and a soft cloth. The morning light caught the subtle blue tint of the metal, making it shimmer almost like real flowers. "Looking mighty fine, Miss Maddie," Mrs. Pearl approved. "Your mama would have loved seeing you put your heart into something beautiful like this." Maddie's hands stilled for a moment, then resumed their gentle polishing. "Thanks, Mrs. Pearl. I think she would have too." The screech of tires announced Pastor Ruth's arrival in her ancient pickup truck. She hopped out, waving a newspaper. "Have y'all seen the headlines? Community triumphs. Local heroes stand for justice," she grinned. "And that's just the start. The phone at the church office hasn't stopped ringing, people wanting to know how they can help with the community programs in the CBA." Eli accepted the paper, scanning the front-page photo of last night's confrontation at the gala. There he stood next to Lottie, both of them looking more determined than he remembered feeling in the moment. The article praised their grassroots victory for small-town values over corporate interests. The sound of more vehicles approaching drew their attention. A steady stream of townspeople began arriving. The hardware store owner, with his famous peach cobbler, the barber shop quartet, who insisted on singing their congratulations, young mothers with children who wanted to see Maddie's sculpture, veterans who'd been helped at the free repair day. The garage's parking lot slowly filled with people and covered dishes. Around 10 o'clock, Lottie's hybrid pulled in. She stepped out looking both professional and somehow softer than her usual public appearance, wearing a simple blue dress instead of her usual tailored suits. Her smile was radiant as she made her way through the impromptu gathering, stopping to hug Mrs. Pearl and accept congratulations from others. When she reached Eli, her eyes were bright with excitement. "The board meeting just finished," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "They voted me in as chair, unanimously." "Of course they did," Eli replied softly. "They know real leadership when they see it." Maddie bounded over from her sculpture. "Does this mean you get to keep helping people your way?" Lottie nodded, pulling the teenager into a quick hug. "Even better than before. We're already drafting new guidelines for all foundation projects. They'll have to include community benefit agreements from the start." Mrs. Pearl appeared with 3 plates of food. "Well then, you all better eat to keep your strength up. Sounds like there's plenty of good work ahead." They found themselves settled on the tailgate of Eli's truck, sharing food and watching the informal celebration unfold. Someone had brought a portable radio, and old country songs mixed with the sound of laughter and conversation. Children darted between the adults, occasionally stopping to stare in wonder at Maddie's sculpture. "When do you want to install it?" Eli asked his daughter, nodding toward the bluebonnets. Maddie considered, wiping her hands on a napkin. "Maybe this afternoon? The concrete pad at the community center should be cured enough by now." "I'd like to help if you don't mind," Lottie offered. "It feels right, being part of putting something permanent and beautiful in place." They finished their food as the morning crowd began to thin, people heading back to their own businesses and responsibilities. The three of them worked together to store the generous offerings of food in the garage's small break room fridge. Later, standing in the driveway, they paused to watch the wind ripple through patches of real bluebonnets that had sprouted along the fence line. The wildflowers swayed gently, their delicate petals catching the light just like Maddie's sculpture. The breeze carried the sweet scent of spring and new beginnings, while somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed the hour. Maddie's work stood ready for transport, carefully wrapped and secured on a trailer. Like the real flowers nodding in the wind, it represented both strength and beauty. Metal shaped by caring hands into something that would last, reaching skyward with hopeful petals of steel. The morning air hummed with excitement as a crowd gathered outside Gardner's garage. The fresh blue paint on the Pearl Washington Apprentice Bay sign glinted in the early light. Mrs. Pearl herself stood near the entrance, her eyes glistening as she smoothed her Sunday dress. "I never thought I'd see the day," she said, patting Eli's arm. "A place where our young folks can learn a proper trade, right here in Riverbend." Eli nodded, his throat tight with emotion. 5 eager faces, 3 teenagers, and 2 veterans waited by the bay doors, their new work shirts crisp and clean. Maddie had helped design the program logo, a wrench crossed with a teaching pencil. "All right, folks," Eli called out, his voice steady and warm. "Let's get started." He pulled out his keys, the familiar jingle drawing smiles from the crowd. The lock clicked open, and the large bay doors rolled up smoothly, revealing the newly equipped training space. Inside, gleaming tool chests lined one wall, each labeled with a trainee's name. A classroom area occupied one corner, complete with a whiteboard and comfortable chairs donated by the church. Diagrams of engines and car systems decorated the walls, alongside Mrs. Pearl's Freedom quilt, which she'd insisted on lending as a reminder of the community's strength. The first veteran, Jim Torres, stepped forward. His hands, used to holding military equipment, now reached for a basic socket set. "Never thought I'd get another chance to learn something new," he said quietly. 16-year-old Marcus Williams stood beside him, eyes wide with wonder. "This is really happening? We really get to learn all this?" "Every bit of it," Eli confirmed, laying out the day's lesson plans. "And you'll be teaching others someday too. That's how we keep our community strong." Across town at the Hale Foundation offices, Lottie settled into her new role as chair. Her desk held stacks of proposal drafts, after-school programs, senior transportation services, small business grants. Each folder represented a chance to help Riverbend thrive. Sarah, her assistant, brought in another stack of papers. "The board loved your idea about partnering with Gardner's Garage," she said. "They're especially excited about the scholarship program for female mechanics." Lottie smiled, thinking of Maddie's determination with her welding projects. "It's amazing what can happen when we invest in people instead of just buildings." The morning flew by at the garage. Eli demonstrated basic oil changes, while Mrs. Pearl shared stories of her father, who'd worked on cars despite being denied formal training during segregation. The apprentices absorbed everything, both the technical skills and the history behind their opportunity. During lunch break, Pastor Ruth delivered sandwiches and lemonade. The group gathered around a folding table, talking and laughing like family. Young Marcus showed Jim how to use a smartphone app for diagnostic codes, while Jim shared stories about maintaining vehicles in desert conditions. Lottie arrived mid-afternoon, carrying boxes of new safety equipment, a gift from the foundation. She paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. Eli stood at a workbench, patiently showing a teenage girl how to check brake pads. His hands moved with practiced grace as he explained each step. He looked up and caught her eye, his smile warming the entire bay. The light streaming through the high windows caught the silver in his hair, and Lottie felt her heart skip. This was what real change looked like, not in grand gestures, but in quiet moments of teaching and learning. Mrs. Pearl shuffled over to Lottie, linking their arms. "Look at that," she whispered. "My daddy would have wept to see this day. All these young ones learning, no matter their color or background. This is what we fought for." The afternoon session focused on basic electrical systems. Eli moved between workstations, answering questions and offering encouragement. The veterans picked up the concepts quickly, their military training evident in their methodical approach. The teenagers brought fresh enthusiasm and quick minds for modern technology. Around 4 o'clock, Maddie arrived from school. She proudly installed her bluebonnet sculpture near the entrance, its metal petals catching the light just right. The apprentices gathered around to admire her work, and she beamed with pride when Jim asked her to teach him welding someday. As the first training day wound down, Eli gathered everyone for a closing circle. "Remember," he said, "what we're building here is bigger than cars. We're building community. Every person who drives away from this garage should feel safer, respected, and cared for." The apprentices nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of their role. Mrs. Pearl led them in a prayer of thanksgiving, her strong voice carrying to the rafters. After the last apprentice left, Eli and Lottie walked out to his front porch. The evening air was soft, with approaching summer, carrying the scent of wild honeysuckle. They settled onto the old swing, its familiar creak, a comfort rather than an annoyance now. Lottie slipped her hand into Eli's, their fingers intertwining naturally. Below them, River Bend spread out in the golden evening light. The community center's windows glowed warmly, and children played basketball on the newly resurfaced court. Down Main Street, the historic barbershop's striped pole spun steadily, a beacon of tradition preserved. The setting sun painted the sky, in shades of pink and orange, casting long shadows across the town they'd fought so hard to protect. In the distance, a train whistle echoed, not a sound of change coming to destroy, but of life continuing, growing, improving. Eli's thumb traced gentle circles on Lottie's palm as they watched their town settle into evening. Together, they'd helped build something precious, a future where profit didn't overcome people, where history was honored while progress marched forward, where every person had a chance to learn, grow, and belong. The first stars began to appear as darkness gathered. Through the garage windows, the new sign for the Pearl Washington Apprentice Bay glowed softly. A promise kept, a dream realized, a testament to what love and determination could achieve. Dawn painted the sky in gentle strokes of pink and gold as Eli stirred awake to the rich aroma of coffee wafting through the farmhouse. The old floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he made his way downstairs, following the familiar scent to the kitchen. Through the window, he spotted Maddie in the driveway, her blonde ponytail swinging as she gestured animatedly. Two men in crisp work shirts, Jim Torres and Mike Reynolds, both veterans from yesterday's opening, stood beside her, nodding as she pointed out the dedicated spots for their personal tool storage. "Each kit gets its own locked cabinet," Maddie explained, her voice carrying through the screen door. "Dad says it's important for mechanics to have their tools organized just how they like them." Eli smiled, pouring himself a cup of coffee. His daughter had taken to teaching as naturally as she had to welding. The sound of tires on gravel drew his attention back to the window as Lottie's sedan pulled up, its navy paint gleaming in the morning light. She emerged, carrying an armload of manila folders, her business attire a contrast to the casual atmosphere of the farmhouse kitchen. "Morning," she called out, navigating the screen door with practiced ease. After just a few weeks, she moved through their space like she belonged there. "You're here early," Eli said, taking some of the folders from her arms. "Couldn't sleep," Lottie admitted, setting her load on the kitchen table. "Too many ideas spinning around. The foundation board approved our initial funding proposals yesterday afternoon. Maddie came bounding in, leaving the veterans to settle their tool stations. "Did they say yes to everything?" she asked, reaching for the orange juice in the fridge. "Almost everything." Lottie spread the folders across the table, each labeled with neat tabs. Community center repairs, housing assistance, trade school scholarships, small business support. Eli pulled out chairs for everyone as they gathered around the plans. The morning sun streamed through the windows, warming the wooden table where so many of their crucial conversations had taken place over the past weeks. "The community center roof can't wait much longer," Lottie said, opening the first folder. "Pastor Ruth says they've been using buckets to catch leaks during services." "I can get my crew started on that next week," Eli offered, scanning the repair estimates. "We'll do the labor at cost, save some of the funding for other projects." Maddie leaned over the housing assistance paperwork. "Mrs. Pearl was telling me about Mr. Johnson at the barber shop. His rent's going up again next month." Lottie nodded, pulling out a spreadsheet. "That's why we're starting the Rent Stability Fund right away. The foundation will match any local donations dollar for dollar. We've already got commitments from 3 regional banks to contribute." They worked through the morning, mapping out timelines and budgets. Eli's practical knowledge of construction costs helped refine the building repair plans, while Lottie's experience with grant writing opened doors for additional funding. Maddie chimed in with insights about which families needed help most urgently, her perspective shaped by years of listening to conversations at the garage. Around mid-morning, Jim and Mike knocked on the screen door, their tool stations organized and ready. "Miss Maddie showed us the ropes," Jim said, his weathered face brightening. "Never seen a setup quite like this. Everything has its place." "That's all her doing," Eli said proudly. "She designed the whole storage system." The veterans' presence reminded them of another pressing need. Lottie pulled out the trade school scholarship proposals. "We need to make sure there's a clear path from apprenticeship to certification," she said. "The foundation can cover tuition and books, but we'll need mentors to guide them through the process." "I've got some ideas about that," Maddie said, pulling her sketchbook from her back pocket. She flipped to a page filled with diagrams. "What if we set up regular workshops? Bring in specialists to teach specific skills? Dad's got connections with master mechanics all over the county." The morning stretched into afternoon as they refined their plans. The kitchen table became command central, covered in papers and possibilities. They ordered sandwiches from the diner down the street, not wanting to break the productive flow of their planning session. As the day wound down, they moved to the living room, where the comfortable familiarity of worn furniture invited more relaxed conversation. Maddie curled up in her favorite armchair, sketchbook balanced on her knees as she worked on designs for a new town welcome sign. "What about incorporating bluebonnets?" she mused, pencil moving swiftly across the paper. "Like my sculpture, but with the town name worked in?" Eli watched from his spot on the couch as Lottie leaned over to study Maddie's sketch. The two had developed an easy rapport that warmed his heart. Lottie pointed to a detail in the design, and Maddie nodded enthusiastically, making adjustments. The evening air grew soft and golden, filtering through the curtains Mrs. Pearl had helped them hang last spring. On the coffee table, their day's work lay in neat stacks, each folder representing another step toward the future they'd fought so hard to secure. The room felt warm with purpose, not just the physical warmth of a Texas evening, but the deeper warmth of people united in doing good work. Their plans weren't just papers and numbers, they were blueprints for hope, sketches of a community growing stronger together. Maddie added final touches to her welcome sign design, the scratch of her pencil a gentle counterpoint to the quiet conversation between Eli and Lottie as they reviewed tomorrow's schedule. The old house creaked and settled around them, as comfortable with their presence as they were with each other. The morning sun climbed higher as Lottie's sedan cruised along Highway 29, fields of wildflowers blurring past the windows. Eli sat in the passenger seat, his work shirt exchanged for a pressed blue button-down that Maddie had insisted he wear for the meeting. "You're awful quiet over there," Lottie said, glancing his way. "Nervous about the presentation?" Eli shook his head, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Just thinking about another drive I took on this road, back in my army days, reminds me of something that happened in Afghanistan. Lottie adjusted the air conditioning, keeping one hand steady on the wheel. Tell me about it. It was during my second tour, Eli began, his voice softening with memory. We were running a medical convoy through this narrow mountain pass, real treacherous terrain. Had a young private, Kenny Martinez, riding shotgun in my ambulance. He paused, looking out at the passing landscape. Insurgents hit us with an IED. Martinez took shrapnel to the chest. The road was blocked by debris, radio was dead, and we were sitting ducks for snipers. Lottie listened intently, unconsciously slowing the car. What did you do? Only thing I could do. I got Martinez into the back, commandeered a local farmer's donkey cart, and spent 6 hours navigating goat paths through the mountains. Kept talking to him the whole time, even when he was unconscious, telling him about Texas sunsets and my mama's peach cobbler. Eli's hands moved as he spoke, sketching the scene. The odds were impossible, but something just wouldn't let me give up. Did he make it? A warm smile spread across Eli's face. He did. Opens a garage of his own now, down in San Antonio. Sends me a Christmas card every year with a picture of his kids. Lottie absorbed this, her fingers drumming lightly on the steering wheel. Is that why you became a mechanic after coming home, trading one kind of fixing for another? Partly, Eli nodded. Found I needed work that kept my hands busy and helped people. Cars made sense. They either run or they don't. No politics, no gray areas. They drove in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Lottie spoke again. I understand that need for something solid to hold on to. She took a deep breath. Did I ever tell you about my father's hardware store? Eli shook his head. He built it from nothing, that store. 30 years of honest work, fair prices, helping folks find exactly what they needed. Her voice carried a hint of old pain. Then, this big development company moved in, promised to revitalize the whole downtown area, said all the right things about progress and opportunity. What happened? They squeezed him out, changed traffic patterns so nobody could easily reach his parking lot, raised property taxes through special assessments. Within 2 years, he had to declare bankruptcy. Lottie's knuckles whitened slightly on the steering wheel. I was in college when it happened. Watched my father, this proud, capable man, have to sell his dream for pennies on the dollar. That's why you fought so hard against Trent's original plans, Eli said quietly. Yeah, I thought maybe working with developers from the inside, through the foundation, I could make them do things differently. A wry smile crossed her face. Turned out I needed a small-town mechanic to show me there was a better way. They pulled into the parking lot of the Veterans Housing Alliance, a modest brick building with flags flying out front. The meeting went smoothly, Lottie's polished presentation skills complementing Eli's straightforward sincerity as they laid out their vision for affordable veterans housing near Riverbend's Main Street. 2 hours later, they emerged with signed preliminary agreements and matching grins. The nonprofit would match funds for a 12-unit complex, with priority given to local veterans. I think this calls for celebration, Lottie said, as they got back on the highway. A few miles down the road, she pulled into the gravel lot of the Blue Bonnet Diner, a weathered building with cheerful red-checked curtains in the windows. Inside, they slid into a booth beneath a faded photograph of the diner's opening day in 1962. A grandmotherly waitress named Betty brought them coffee and 2 slices of apple pie still warm from the oven. Remember that time you nearly ran your truck into Johnson's cow? Lottie teased, taking a bite of pie. Eli pointed his fork at her. That cow was suicidal, and you know it. Besides, wasn't I the one who had to talk you through changing a tire in the rain last week? Hey, I got it done. After calling me 3 times to make sure you had the jack in the right spot. They shared a laugh, comfortable in the easy rhythm they'd developed. The pie disappeared slowly as they traded stories about their worst driving mishaps. Lottie's infamous parallel parking attempt at her driver's test, Eli's adventure with a trailer full of hay bales that came loose on a hill. The sun was setting as they approached Riverbend, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples. They were still chuckling about Betty's parting advice to drive careful but not too careful when Lottie turned onto Main Street. Their laughter faded as they spotted the familiar black SUV parked in front of the community center. The vehicle's tinted windows reflected the sunset, but the vanity plate left no doubt. It was Trent's. The community center's fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the gathered elders seated in folding chairs. Trent Kincaid stood at the front, his silver hair perfectly styled, gesturing at a glossy rendering of Main Street propped on an easel. "Just imagine," he said, his voice smooth as polished marble. "New sidewalks lined with trees, restored storefronts, and modern amenities that will bring fresh energy to Riverbend while preserving its cherished character." Mrs. Pearl Washington sat in the front row, her weathered hands folded over her walking cane, expression unreadable. Next to her, Mr. Jenkins, who'd run the barber shop for 40 years, frowned deeply at the presentation. The wooden double doors creaked open. Eli and Lottie stepped into the room, still dressed for their nonprofit meeting. A flicker of something annoyance perhaps crossed Trent's face before his practiced smile returned. "Well, what perfect timing," Trent said, spreading his arms wide. "Charlotte, alive, we're just discussing the exciting improvements coming to our beloved town." "Is that what we're calling it?" Mr. Jenkins muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Lottie moved to stand near Mrs. Pearl, while Eli leaned against the wall, arms crossed but posture relaxed. The tension in the room thickened like summer storm clouds. "I must say, Charlotte," Trent continued, emphasizing her formal name, "some of our mutual acquaintances have expressed concern about your recent policy shifts at the foundation." He adjusted his silk tie. "Several major donors feel the organization might be straying from its established mission." "The mission hasn't changed," Lottie replied evenly. "We're still dedicated to community development. We're just ensuring it happens with, rather than to the community." A few of the elders nodded in approval. Mrs. Pearl's fingers tapped her cane thoughtfully. "Noble sentiments." Trent's smile didn't reach his eyes. "But sentiment doesn't build buildings or create jobs. The board members I spoke with yesterday worry that your emotional attachment to certain local elements might be clouding your judgment." "The board approved our new initiatives unanimously," Lottie said, her voice firm but calm. "Boards can change their minds," Trent shrugged elegantly, "especially when major funding sources express reservations." Eli straightened from his position against the wall. "The Community Benefits Agreement is legally binding, Trent. Signed and notarized in front of 200 witnesses." Of course," Trent waved his hand dismissively. "And we'll honor every letter of it. But there's so much more to successful development than what's written in contracts. Cooperation, flexibility, maintaining good relationships with investors, these things grease the wheels of progress." "Sounds more like you're trying to grease palms," Mr. Jenkins said clearly this time, drawing a few sharp laughs from the other elders. Trent's polished veneer cracked slightly. "I'm trying to help this town prosper. Charlotte, surely you remember our discussions about lifting communities through strategic investment? About the greater good?" "I remember a lot of talk about greater good," Lottie answered. "But I've learned that good isn't really good unless it includes everybody." A murmur of agreement rippled through the elders. Trent glanced at his expensive watch, his jaw tightening. "Well, I can see this conversation isn't particularly productive right now." He began gathering his presentation materials. "Charlotte, do think carefully about the long-term consequences of your current path. The Foundation's influence extends far beyond Riverbend." "Is that a threat, Mr. Kincaid?" Mrs. Pearl asked, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Simply a reminder of practical realities, Mrs. Washington." Trent slipped his papers into a leather portfolio. "We all have to live in the real world, after all." He strode toward the door, pausing briefly beside Lottie. "I'll be in touch about those donor concerns." Then he was gone, his expensive shoes clicking against the linoleum floor. The room seemed to exhale collectively. Mr. Jenkins stood up, shaking his head. That man could sell sand in the Sahara, but I wouldn't trust him to water my plants. Lottie sank into an empty chair, the morning's long drive, and this confrontation weighing on her shoulders. Eli moved closer, his steady presence reassuring. Mrs. Pearl tapped her cane on the floor, drawing everyone's attention. "You know," she said, her voice rich with years of wisdom, "when I was a girl, my mama used to say that men like that don't stop just because the ink's dry on paper. They just find different pens to write with." The others nodded, gathering their things and slowly filtering out of the room. Eli and Lottie remained, watching Mrs. Pearl rise carefully from her chair. Mr. Jenkins offered his arm, and she patted it gratefully. The early morning sun cast long shadows across Gardner's garage as Eli worked under the hood of Mrs. Chen's aging Volvo. The familiar scent of motor oil and metal filled the air, mingling with the fresh spring breeze drifting through the open bay doors. Pastor Ruth's sensible shoes clicked against the concrete floor as she approached, a cream-colored envelope clutched in her hands. "Eli, you need to see this," she called out, her voice carrying a note of urgency that made him straighten up and wipe his hands on a nearby rag. "What's that you've got?" he asked, noticing the yellowed edges of the envelope. "Found it while helping clean out old Mr. Harrison's house," Pastor Ruth explained. "His son was going through boxes in the attic when he came across it. It's from Tommy Chen. You remember him? Served in Korea, owned that big stretch of land where Trent wants to build those luxury condos." Eli nodded, remembering the kind-faced veteran who used to let neighborhood kids fly kites on his property. "Tommy passed about 15 years ago, didn't he?" "Yes, but this letter." Pastor Ruth carefully extracted several pages of faded paper. This could change everything. The bell above the office door chimed, and Lottie walked in wearing a simple blue blouse and carrying a stack of foundation paperwork. She paused when she saw their serious expressions. "What's wrong?" "Come see for yourself," Pastor Ruth said, spreading the letter across Eli's workbench. The handwriting was neat and precise, detailing agreements made in 1955 between Tommy Chen and the town council. Tommy had sold portions of his land at below market value, with specific conditions. Certain areas were to remain open spaces for community use, and the historic buildings along Main Street were to be preserved for local businesses. "Look at this," Lottie said, her finger tracing a particular paragraph. "He specifically mentions the old mercantile building and the row of shops leading to the barber shop. There are sketches, too, with exact measurements and property lines." Eli leaned closer, studying the detailed drawings. "These are legally binding promises, aren't they?" "More than that," Lottie replied, excitement growing in her voice. "This could be grounds for historical landmark status. The town's preservation society tried years ago but didn't have enough documentation. This letter provides exactly what was missing: proof of the building's historical significance and the original owner's intent." Pastor Ruth smiled knowingly. Tommy Chen was always thinking ahead. He must have known someday someone would try to change things. "We need to get this to the town clerk right away," Lottie said, already gathering the papers carefully. "Historical landmark status would make it nearly impossible for Trent to demolish these buildings or fundamentally alter their character." Eli grabbed his keys. "I'll drive. Just let me tell Bobby to watch the shop." He stuck his head into the garage bay where his senior mechanic was working. "Hey Bobby, can you handle things for a couple hours? Got some urgent business at town hall." "No problem, boss," Bobby called back, giving a thumbs up from under a raised pickup truck. The drive to town hall took less than 10 minutes, but Lottie spent every second studying the letter, pointing out relevant details. "See here?" Tommy even specified the minimum width of sidewalks and maximum building heights. He wanted to preserve the town's walkable character. At the clerk's office, Mrs. Delacroix, who'd worked there for 30 years, recognized the significance of their discovery immediately. "Oh my stars," she breathed, putting on her reading glasses to examine the documents. "I remember when Tommy made this agreement. I was just starting here as an assistant." She led them to a small conference room where they could spread out the paperwork. For the next hour, they filled out forms for historical landmark designation, with Mrs. Delacroix providing supporting documentation from the town archives. "The Preservation Board meets next week," she told them, stamping the final form. "I'll make sure this gets priority review." As they walked out of the clerk's office, Lottie and Eli emerged into the bright spring sunshine. The air was sweet with blooming dogwood trees that lined the courthouse square. Neither noticed Maddie, who'd been waiting outside after school, raising her phone to capture the moment, both of them smiling, shoulders relaxed, relief evident in their faces as they stepped into the warm light. The photograph would later show something more. Two people who'd found unexpected strength in standing together for what was right, their expressions holding equal measures of hope and determination. Behind them, the old courthouse clock tower rose against a perfectly blue Texas sky, its weathered face marking not just the hour, but a moment when the tide began to turn in Riverbend's favor. Main Street buzzed with the joyful chaos of Riverbend's spring fair. Streamers in pastel colors danced between lampposts, and the scent of funnel cakes and barbecue wafted through the warm afternoon air. Children darted between booths with sticky fingers and painted faces, while parents chatted in clusters near picnic tables, laden with potluck dishes. At the center of it all stood Maddie's new welcome sign, draped in blue fabric for the big reveal. The metal framework peeked out from beneath, hinting at the intricate welding work she'd poured her heart into over the past weeks. A small crowd had already gathered, with Mrs. Pearl in the front row fanning herself with a paper program. "You ready for this?" Eli asked, giving Maddie's shoulder a gentle squeeze. She nodded, fidgeting with the hem of her Gardener's Garage t-shirt. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, trying to sound casual despite the tremor in her voice. Lottie stepped up to the microphone, her sundress catching the late afternoon light. "Everyone, if I could have your attention, please," she called out, and the crowd quieted. "Today marks more than just our annual spring fair. It's a celebration of what makes Riverbend special, our community spirit." She gestured to where the 4 new apprentices from Gardener's Garage had set up their fix-it booth. They were already busy, heads bent over toasters and desk lamps brought in by hopeful neighbors. 2 veterans worked alongside teenagers, sharing tools and expertise with easy camaraderie. "And now," Lottie continued, "I'd like to introduce someone who embodies that spirit, Maddie Gardner, whose artistic vision will welcome visitors to our town for years to come." Maddie walked up, her cheeks flushing as applause broke out. With help from Eli and one of the apprentices, she pulled the fabric away to reveal her creation. The metal letters caught the sunlight, each one carefully crafted and painted in warm copper tones. "Welcome to Riverbend, where neighbors are family." Worked into the framework were delicate metal bluebonnets, so realistic they seemed to sway in the breeze. The whole piece managed to look both sturdy and graceful, like the town itself. A collective "oh" rose from the crowd, followed by enthusiastic applause. Mrs. Pearl dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while Pastor Ruth beamed from her spot near the lemonade stand. "Did you weld all those flowers by hand?" someone called out. Maddie stepped up to the microphone, her voice stronger now. "Each one's different, just like us," she explained. "But they all fit together to make something beautiful." The crowd dispersed to enjoy the fair, but people kept stopping by to admire the sign. Near the fix-it booth, an elderly man watched as one of the veteran apprentices showed a teenager how to rewire a vintage radio. "Just like old times," he commented to Eli. "Reminds me of when my daddy taught me to fix things." Meanwhile, Lottie had transformed the community center's front room into an elegant space for the silent auction. Local artists had donated paintings, Mrs. Pearl contributed one of her famous quilts, and even Maddie had included a smaller metal sculpture. The proceeds would go directly to the rent assistance program. "These bids are amazing," Lottie whispered to Eli as she checked the sheets. "We might hit our 6-month goal in one night." The sun began to set, casting long shadows across Main Street. String lights flickered to life overhead, creating a warm glow as families spread blankets on the grass near the fairgrounds. The local band set up their equipment, filling the air with the twang of guitar strings being tuned. Maddie's friends from school called her over to their blanket, armed with sparklers and bags of kettle corn. She looked to Eli, who nodded with a smile. "Go on," he said. "Just stay where we can see you when the fireworks start." The evening air grew cooler as darkness fell. The band played a mix of country classics and modern hits while couples swayed on the makeshift dance floor. Near the Fix-It booth, now closed for the day, the apprentices packed up their tools, laughing about the strange items they'd repaired. "Remember that mechanical cat?" one of the teens said. "I still can't believe we got it working again." "Mrs. Rodriguez was sure happy, though," the veteran mentor replied. "Said it was her late husband's favorite decoration." Small victories, Eli thought, watching them. But they added up to something bigger, a community where people looked out for each other, where skills were passed down, where history was honored while embracing change. Lottie appeared at his side, having finished tallying the auction bids. "We did it," she said softly. "Enough for the first 3 months of the program, at least." "Never doubted you for a minute," Eli replied. The first boom of fireworks drew their attention skyward. They moved to the edge of the fairgrounds, finding a quiet spot away from the largest crowds. Red and gold sparks painted the night sky, reflecting in the windows of Main Street's historic buildings that would now be protected under the CBA. Lottie's hand found Eli's in the darkness, their fingers intertwining naturally. Nearby, they could hear Maddie laughing with her friends, the sound mixing with oohs and ahs as each new firework burst overhead. The display painted the town in fleeting colors, blue sparks illuminating the new welcome sign, silver cascades highlighting the garage's apprentice bay, golden streams reflecting off the community center's windows. Each burst seemed to celebrate a different piece of what they'd fought to preserve. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of Riverbend First Methodist, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden pews. The usual Sunday morning bustle had settled into an expectant hush as Pastor Ruth stepped up to the pulpit, her warm smile spreading across her face. "Before we begin today's service," Pastor Ruth said, her voice carrying to the back rows, "I've asked our dear Mrs. Pearl Washington to share something special with us." She gestured to where Mrs. Pearl sat in her usual spot, third pew from the front. Mrs. Pearl rose slowly, her silver hair gleaming in the morning light. She carried a carefully folded quilt in her arms, the fabric well preserved despite its age. As she made her way to the front, Eli noticed Lottie lean forward slightly in her seat, eyes fixed on the elderly woman. "This here," Mrs. Pearl began, her voice strong and clear, "is what we call our freedom quilt." She carefully unfolded it with help from Pastor Ruth, revealing intricate patterns in faded blues, reds, and creams. It was started in 1965, right here in Riverbend, during times that tested all our souls. The congregation sat in rapt attention as Mrs. Pearl's fingers traced the patterns. "Each square tells a story. This one here," she pointed to a star pattern in deep blue, "was sewn by my mama and Miss Sarah Beth Miller together, black hands and white hands, working the same cloth, when some folks said that shouldn't happen." Eli glanced at Maddie, who sat beside him sketching the quilt's patterns in her notebook. Down the pew, Lottie dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "We had us a flood that year," Mrs. Pearl continued, "and it didn't care what color anybody was when it came through. White folks, black folks, we all got wet the same. And when it came time to rebuild," her voice caught slightly, "well, that's when this quilt really started coming together." She moved to another section of the quilt, pointing out different patterns. "Miss Miller's daughter brought soup to our house every day for a week while Mama was sick. Mama taught Miss Sarah Beth's girls how to make proper biscuits, and all that love, all that reaching across what some people called lines that shouldn't be crossed, it went right into this quilt." Several older members of the congregation nodded, some wiping tears. A few murmured quiet amens. "We sewed this quilt in living rooms and church basements," Mrs. Pearl said, her voice growing stronger. "Sometimes we had to be quiet about our meetings. But every stitch was a promise that hate wouldn't win. Every pattern was hope that our children and grandchildren would live in a better Riverbend." She paused, looking out at the congregation. And now here we all sit together, proving those stitches weren't sewn in vain. The silence in the church was profound. Even the youngest children seemed to sense the weight of the moment. Pastor Ruth stepped forward to help Mrs. Pearl fold the quilt, but before she could speak, Lottie stood up from her pew. "Mrs. Pearl," she called out, her voice clear but trembling slightly with emotion. "May I say something?" Mrs. Pearl nodded, and Lottie made her way to the front. She turned to face the congregation, smoothing her skirt with slightly shaking hands. "As the new chair of the Hale Foundation," she began, "I've been thinking about how we honor our town's history. After hearing Mrs. Pearl's story, and seeing how this quilt represents the very best of what Riverbend can be, I'd like to announce something." She took a deep breath. "The Hale Foundation will fund a permanent exhibit at the community center, featuring not just this beautiful quilt, but also recorded oral histories from our elders. Their stories deserve to be preserved and shared with future generations." A murmur of approval rippled through the church. Mrs. Pearl's eyes welled with tears as she reached for Lottie's hand. "We'll make sure these stories are told properly," Lottie continued, her voice growing stronger, "with dignity and truth, showing how everyday courage and simple kindness can change a whole community." Eli watched from his pew, his heart swelling with pride. The woman standing at the front of the church was so different from the shaken passenger he'd pulled from that burning car just weeks ago. Her spine was straight, her voice clear, her conviction unshakable. After the service ended, people lingered in small groups, many gathering around Mrs. Pearl to share memories or touch the quilt reverently. Eli saw Trent Kincaid standing near the back of the church, his usual polished appearance somewhat subdued. The developer made his way through the crowd to where Lottie stood with Mrs. Pearl. "Congratulations on the exhibit announcement," Trent said quietly to Lottie, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "It's a thoughtful project." Lottie nodded graciously, her hand still holding Mrs. Pearl's. "Thank you, Trent. I hope you'll come to the opening when it's ready." The morning sun painted Riverbend in soft golden light as the first wave of bluebonnets dotted the roadside with splashes of vibrant blue. The Texas state flower had always been a herald of spring, but this year they seemed to carry extra meaning, like nature herself was celebrating the town's renewal. Eli and Lottie walked side by side along the freshly mulched border of the community center lawn. The morning dew still clung to the grass, and the air carried the sweet scent of spring flowers. Maddie's metalwork bluebonnet sculpture stood proudly near the entrance, its delicate petals catching the early light. "Hard to believe how different this place looks from just a month ago," Eli said, gesturing to the newly planted flower beds where volunteers had worked over the weekend. Purple salvias and yellow lantanas created a cheerful border around the building. Lottie nodded, watching a butterfly land on one of the fresh blooms. "The garden club really outdid themselves. Mrs. Henderson said she hasn't seen this many people show up to plant flowers since 1985. "That's Riverbend for you," Eli said with a gentle smile. "Give folks a chance to help, and they'll show up in force." They paused near a wooden bench that overlooked the lawn. The morning was still cool enough to be comfortable, and they sat together, shoulders barely touching. "You know what really gets me?" Lottie said, smoothing her cotton skirt. "Yesterday, I saw Tamione, of our new apprentice, teaching Mrs. Pearl's grandson how to change oil. 3 generations working together in that garage of yours." Eli's eyes crinkled at the corners. "That kid's got natural talent. Reminds me of Maddie when she first started tinkering with engines." "Speaking of talent," Lottie said, reaching into her bag. She pulled out a folder with the Hale Foundation letterhead. "I've been working on something. What do you think about establishing a trade school scholarship? We could name it after Sarah." Eli went very still. He hadn't heard anyone speak his late wife's name with such gentle care in a long time. "Sarah would have loved that," he said softly. "She always said education was the key to everything." "We could start with 2 full scholarships a year," Lottie continued, her voice warm with enthusiasm. "Priority for local students, especially those interested in mechanical trades or healthcare, the fields that keep small towns running." "You've really thought this through," Eli said, looking at her with admiration. Lottie tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I've been doing a lot of thinking lately. About purpose. About home. She gazed across the lawn where new saplings had been planted. You know, when I first came to Riverbend, I was just passing through. Or at least, that's what I thought. Funny how life works sometimes, Eli said, watching a pair of cardinals flit between the trees. I had everything in Houston, the fancy office, the charity galas, the right connections, but I never felt like I belonged. Lottie's fingers traced the edge of the folder. Here, though, even when things were falling apart, it felt real. The people felt real. That's because they are, Eli said. No pretense, no hidden agendas, just folks trying their best to look out for each other. A gentle breeze rustled through the bluebonnets, carrying the sweet scent of spring. From somewhere inside the community center, they could hear Maddie's voice mixed with laughter, probably showing the younger kids how to use the new art supplies the foundation had donated. I've been thinking about expanding the apprentice program, Eli said. Maybe add some basic computer repair training. Everything's got a chip in it these days, even tractors. We could partner with a community college, Lottie suggested. Set up some certification courses right here in town. And the community gardens you mentioned last week, we could put them behind the center. Give the seniors something to tend to, teach the kids about growing food. Their ideas flowed naturally, each building on the other's thoughts. This was how they worked best together, practical dreams, grounded in service to others. I never thought I'd find this again, Lottie said quietly. Find what? A place that feels like home. People who feel like family. She turned to face him, her eyes bright with emotion. When my parents died, I thought that was it. That I'd spend the rest of my life trying to do good things but never really belonging anywhere. Eli understood. He'd felt the same way. After losing Sarah, like he was living in a house but not really having a home. But watching Lottie with Maddie, seeing how naturally she fit into their lives and the life of the town, he knew something had changed for all of them. The morning light filtered through the bluebonnets, creating a soft blue haze across the lawn. Maddie's laughter rang out again from inside the building, clear and joyful. Lottie's hand found Eli's, their fingers intertwining naturally. When he turned to look at her, the sunlight caught in her hair, making it glow like honey. She smiled that real, unguarded smile he'd grown to treasure. Their first kiss was gentle, as natural as breathing. It carried the promise of more mornings like this one, more dreams shared, more laughter echoing across the lawn. It spoke of home and healing and hope, all wrapped up in the simple press of lips and the warmth of hands held tight. Maddie's laughter continued to ring out from the distance, a bright counterpoint to the soft morning air and the sweet scent of bluebonnets. The late May sun cast long shadows across Riverbend's Main Street as the town hummed with renewed purpose. The sharp tap of hammers echoed from the roof of Jackson's barber shop, where Eli stood with 3 apprentice veterans, showing them how to properly seal the new shingles. His experienced hands guided their work while explaining each step with patient clarity. "Remember, fellows," he called out, wiping sweat from his brow, "these buildings have stories in their bones. We're not just fixing a roof, we're preserving history." Down below, Mr. Jackson stood watching, his weathered face beaming with pride. The shop had been in his family for 3 generations, and now it would stay that way. One of the apprentices, a young Marine veteran named Carlos, called down, "Don't worry, Mr. Juer, treating her like our own." Across the street at the community center, Lottie moved gracefully between tables decorated with fresh-cut flowers, greeting donors who had come to see their investments at work. The renovated hall gleamed with fresh paint and new hardwood floors, while poster boards displayed photos of completed projects and future plans. The apprenticeship program has already placed 12 veterans in full-time positions, she explained to a group of foundation representatives. And that's just the beginning. We're looking at expanding into green energy training next quarter. The buzz of activity filled every corner of town. The hardware store's bell chimed constantly as contractors came and went. The diner had added extra tables on the sidewalk to accommodate the lunch rush. Even the old bookstore, which had been struggling, now hosted weekly reading circles for kids, while their parents attended job training next door. In the midst of it all, Maddie burst through the garage's office door, waving an envelope. "Dad, Miss Lottie, I got in!" Her voice carried across the street to where Eli was climbing down the ladder. "Full scholarship to the summer welding program." Eli's face lit up with pride as he crossed the street, careful of the increased traffic, another sign of the town's revival. He hugged his daughter tight, motor oil on his shirt, mixing with the glitter she'd somehow gotten in her hair. "Never doubted you for a second, sweetheart." Lottie excused herself from the donors and hurried over to join their celebration. "This calls for a special dinner," she declared, her eyes bright with shared joy. "How about we grab some of Mrs. Chen's famous pot stickers and eat on the porch tonight?" As the sun began its descent, painting the Texas sky in brilliant streaks of pink and gold, they gathered on Eli's front porch. The old swing no longer creaked down of the many small repairs that symbolized their journey. Paper containers of Chinese food spread across the patio table while fireflies began to dance in the gathering dusk. Maddie regaled them with her plans for the summer program, her hands moving animatedly as she described the advanced techniques she'd learned. "And get this, they're going to let us design our own final projects. I'm thinking maybe something with moving parts this time, like a kinetic sculpture." Eli leaned back in his chair, taking in the moment. The sight of his daughter so alive with possibility, the woman beside him who had helped transform their town, the gentle evening breeze carrying the scent of blooming jasminite, all seemed somehow connected to that fiery night on Farm Road 17. "You know," he said softly during a lull in the conversation, "I keep thinking about that night of the wreck." He glanced at Lottie, who set down her chopsticks to listen. "I thought I was just pulling one person from a fire, but really—" He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Really, that night was about saving something bigger. It was about saving hope for all of us." Lottie reached over and squeezed his hand, understanding in her eyes. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of courage. Maddie nodded sagely, looking more grown-up than her 16 years. "Like standing up for what's right, even when it's scary?" "Exactly like that," Lottie agreed. They sat together as night settled fully over Riverbend, the stars emerging one by one in the vast Texas sky. The familiar chorus of crickets rose from the grass, a summer symphony that merged with their quiet laughter and comfortable conversation. The porch lights cast a warm glow over their faces as they shared stories and dreams, now a family bound together by more than circumstance. From the street, the scene painted a picture of contentment. 3 people on a porch, sharing food and fellowship, while around them, a town slept more peacefully than it had in years. The community center stood proud with its new roof. Maddie's bluebonnet sculpture caught the moonlight, and in every direction, evidence of renewal and hope stretched toward the horizon. The evening wrapped around them like a comfortable blanket, filled with the kind of quiet joy that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're meant to be. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. But for now, they simply sat together under the stars, their laughter mixing with the night sounds of a town that had found its way home. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you thought this was just the beginning, you're right. Click through and see where the story takes you next. If you enjoyed the story of Eli Gardner, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.